SECfans.com. Week 14, it's championship week, and we've got a whole lot to talk about, but we've got the games narrowed down so we can really focus on what matters this week. And what matters is who's left. And right now for the SEC, that is Auburn and Georgia. Auburn coming off another slaying of a juggernaut this last weekend in the Iron Bowl. Came away with a pretty decent victory, I'd say. I know any victory for Auburn in that game, 1 point, they'll take it, but a double-digit win is pretty great. Getting into this game, I want to talk first because we've seen so much with Auburn in the two of the last 3 weeks. We kind of know a lot about them, but Georgia kind of went away after that loss to Auburn 3 weeks ago. They kind of went away, but they've been hanging back. They had a blowout win over Georgia Tech, looked really clean. And I'm going to lead with something that might ruffle a few Auburn feathers, but hold on, y'all. We're going to come back to you. And before we get into that, I want to remind y'all, in the comments, give us your score predictions, give us your MVPs, and just mix it up. We'll make sure you back up your points with data, and we'll get in there with you. All right, so talking about Georgia, I think it's kind of crazy. We talked about this last week when we went into the Georgia Tech preview, that it's nuts that a team with such potential and such, accolades throughout the year was just forgotten after one loss. And I think it's a worthy discussion to say that not only should they have not been forgotten, but they very well may be able to win this game. Is that a crazy thing to say, having seen them beat Alabama, having seen them blow out Georgia? Is this a game that is kind of a foregone conclusion, like when Auburn played Tennessee twice in a year, blew them out, and went on to greatness? Or is there something there? Could Georgia come away with a win in this one?
I think it's certainly possible, and you can't count it out. Auburn dominated the first game, and you got to give them a lot of credit for that. But more importantly, you have to give a lot of credit to the matchups and the way those played out in that game. I think sometimes people get way too caught up in the fact that, well, Auburn blew them out last time, so they'll blow them out again. It really was uncharacteristic for both teams to a large extent, right? Auburn has not blown out every team 40-17 in a dominant fashion at that level. They didn't beat LSU that badly. They beat Alabama strong by a strong, solid performance last week. They didn't beat them 40-17. That was really uncharacteristic for both teams. I think there's a little bit of an overreaction that Georgia just isn't any good because they have been dominant, really outside that one game all year. Maybe the Notre Dame game early, but for the most part, just kind of dominated all season. Georgia is not a bad team. Auburn beat them like they were a bad team. And that's why I think that game probably isn't necessarily something that's just going to repeat itself, because that was a performance that, as much as Auburn did very, very well, that really was uncharacteristic of Georgia to get beaten that badly. That shouldn't have happened. It was a tremendous thing that it did happen, that goes on Auburn's resume. You deserve the credit for that. But if we're talking about predictive aspect, nobody should beat Georgia 40-17 this year. They're too good for that. Their defense is too good to give up 40 points on a regular basis. And Auburn is not necessarily good enough to score 40 points on any team they play. Again, even in the dominant performance last week against Alabama, and I say dominant to a large extent because statistically it wasn't that dominant. They only scored 26 points. So I don't think it's crazy to say Georgia has a shot in this game. And as we'll get to later, probably a very good shot. And I think you have to be very careful in looking at past results in order to predict future action.
When you say Auburn isn't that dominant, you're not saying that they're not a team that could win a national championship. You're just saying that, well, I don't want to say what you're saying. Maybe clarify that statement, because we see Auburn having 2 wins over number 1 teams in the span of 3 weeks. Auburn fans are going to say, well, that looks pretty dominant to me. And my takeaway, having heard you talk about them all year, everything we say is in the context of who you're going to have to play and beat to win a national championship. Obviously, since we're talking about you in this context, I think we think you're worthy of that discussion. So maybe clarify what you're saying when you say dominant.
Well, the statement I was trying to make was that they weren't so dominant that they would necessarily walk in and win 40-17 repeatedly against a top 5 team. There have been teams that were able to do that in history. Those teams, really the best example in my mind was the Vince Young national title. USC and Texas destroyed everyone they played all year. And those teams could play a lot of really, really good football teams and absolutely take them to the woodshed. I don't think anybody this season in college football is at quite that level. I think Auburn is a very, very good team that is capable of dominating any opponent on a given week. But Auburn also lost 2 games for a reason. Auburn is not so head and shoulders above everyone that you should expect them to beat a top 5 team 40-17 every week. They haven't done that all season. They've done it 2 of the past 3 weeks, and that's a tremendous indicator. But I don't necessarily think that's going to continue every single week. And if you go through the playoffs, I think everyone sort of understands you're not going to go through the SEC championship in the semifinal and the final and win all those games by 35 points. So that's what I mean when I say they're not that dominant. I don't mean to say, well, they're not that dominant of a team. I mean to say they're not so dominant that they can necessarily win at that rate against teams that are that good every single day. You're going to have up games, you're going to have down games. That was what happened when Georgia had a really, really poor result and Auburn had a very, very good result. I think it's extremely notable that that was a home game at Auburn with a quarterback in Stidham that has been far more comfortable at home than away. And you were playing a guy, Jake Fromm, who had never been asked to throw the ball with any frequency and had never really played in a hostile road crowd. So you take all that together, and I'm just saying I don't think the 40-17 result was normal for either program. That was a very good day for Auburn and a poor day for Georgia. I'm not necessarily saying Georgia will win when I say that. I'm just saying, okay, it's not out of the realm of possibility to say that if Georgia plays their best game and Auburn plays a rough game, that Georgia will win the
All right, so I'm going to have you take both angles on this. Um, so when you get this question up front, know that the opposite question is coming right after it. Having Auburn and Georgia having played the game that they played, and Georgia going in on the road and now having tape from that game to be able to see how Auburn played against them in terms of matchups and such. And then having another game of tape of seeing how they played against a not super similar defense, but as or more talented defense in Alabama. Tell me what the takeaways are from that, given that experience that Georgia could take to possibly win this football game.
We complained all year that we felt like Georgia had not done a very good job of managing their quarterback situation. And we even released a video where we titled controversially, and I'm going to blame you for this, that Fromm overrated. And the reason we were saying that was he was getting a crazy amount of hype as this guy could never lose a football game. We were stepping back and going, whoa, whoa, whoa. You're not asking him to throw even 15 passes in a ball game. And it's a really bad idea to have a quarterback that you have never asked to play meaningful reps to go into an experience like a road game at Auburn. And now you're going to try to ask him to throw the ball 30 times. I thought he actually played pretty well in that game, but it was really obvious to me that their passing game was rusty. There were a lot of drop balls. There were a lot of missed opportunities. There was one play in particular where Ridley is deep in the middle of the field. The ball basically goes through his hands. He's 20 yards in front of everybody. Those are plays that happens when a team isn't used to doing them on a routine basis. And you could kind of get a sense of panic to a certain extent. Georgia's going to look back at that tape and they're going to go, man, we could have executed a lot better and made a lot of plays that would have had a really big difference in that ball game. So that's the first thing, before any sort of schematic issue, they're just going to look at this and go, hey, if we try to execute at a different level, we're going to be a lot more successful. And they're also going to look back again, when we say they haven't passed the ball much, if you looked at 2 Georgia series, right? If you took 2 Georgia series and ran them back to back, 3-play series, they averaged the first series being 3 runs and the second series being 2 runs and a pass. In other words, out of 6 plays, they would pass the ball once. That's where they were at going into that game. I think they realized they have to be a lot more balanced. I think they've worked for the past 2 weeks to gain balance. They've scored a lot of points in the process. You've seen Fromm be more than just the very simple game manager. Now, I still think it was disappointing that they didn't have him throw the ball more against Kentucky or Georgia Tech. Again, 14, 16 passes in those 2 ball games, but the type of throws they had him make, a lot more passes to receivers. They're going to have to do those things to be able to win the game. And I think they've also realized, okay, we can't just try to, steam ahead and be this sort of strange, we're going to run the ball out of shotgun formations without passing. They have to have an identity so that you can either go with a real run sets and you can attack the middle of the field, or you can go wide and you can throw to the receivers, but don't try to mesh the two. And I'm having a hard time formulating this, but really the point I'm trying to make is when Georgia played Auburn last time, Georgia had a lot of sets where they would go 5 or 6 man protections and they'd have 3 or 4 guys wide. And what it let Auburn do was get their fastest linebackers in the field. Atkinson was on the field a lot. And Auburn was able to really comfortably play sideline to sideline to Michel and Chubb. They didn't have to do a ton of stuff in base personnel defensively. And the other thing that I think is very notable that I haven't touched on yet, Georgia is going to learn a lot from the defensive tape from the Auburn game. Auburn used a lot of shifts and motions. It's been talked about a lot. Chip Kelly did breakdowns on it, but it was absolutely true. Kirby Smart, dating back to his time at Alabama, had issues where his defense is often very effective because it's complicated. It disguises a lot of looks. Guys have a lot of different responsibilities. It's taken them about 2 years to get that installed, but they've been very effective in most games. Auburn uses a combination of hurry up and motion to confuse it. And when I say that, they will quickly get to the line in one set. The defense looks one way to get a call, and then Auburn will immediately motion the entire offense into a different formation. They make really good use of their tight ends and H-backs in this role because they'll line up. You'll have a 2 tight end set. You expect them to go 7-man protection, 2 tight ends into the line. They'll spin them both wide, and you end up in a 4 wide set. Is it really hard to cover a tight end? Not necessarily. But if you have your defense on the field that's a standard defense, you can end up with some really confusing situations because you may have it where your outside linebackers have a called blitz. Well, now those outside linebackers, because you only have 2 corners on the field, you've got 4 linebackers in a 3-4, maybe those outside linebackers have to shift out to cover the 2 tight ends that are, we're saying a 2-by-2 formation, so 2 guys on either side of the field. If those linebackers are out wide and they have a called blitz, you either now have to have the defense that's smart enough to immediately know we have to check out of this into a particular defense, or they're going to blitz from way off on the outside of the field where they're a long way away from the play, and they're going to completely destroy the integrity of your coverage because you have 2 corners each covering 2 guys, so 2 corners on 4 receivers. And that caused chaos in Georgia. And I think one of the more subtle things that happened is they got Georgia in a lot of situations where you have all these complicated play calls. And when you put yourself in, again, you motion into a 3 or 4 wide set and Georgia's in base personnel. Now, even if they know, hey, we've got to check out of it, now the base personnel has to know how to run a play that was designed for the dime package. And that outside linebacker probably doesn't see any reps to know, hey, what is my pattern matching scheme on a slot receiver in a trip set? That's not something he's ever asked to do, and it just created a lot of chaos. They've got to simplify things tremendously, I think, and they're going to probably spend a lot of time looking specifically at the things they did wrong. They can clean those up because at the end of the day, I think on both sides of the ball, it was missed opportunities that blew that game. Auburn, from a per play perspective, really did sort of dominate that game. I'm not going to undercut it. 1.4 yards per carry by Georgia and 5.2 yards per carry from Auburn was really the damning statistic of the game. But a lot of what happened in that game from both sides of the ball were Auburn executing what they wanted to do very well, Georgia not executing, and the combination being the Auburn runs a screen or they run a toss sweep and nobody's in the gap. So the guy runs for 8 yards. And Auburn did a very good job, but that should have been a 3 or 4 yard play if somebody was in the right assignment. All that stuff's going to get cleaned up to a large extent because now Georgia can identify exactly what they did wrong, home in on that, and spend a lot of time preparing for it. The problem with all this is, even if they get all this right, it's not like they've got to make up a score or 2 difference. Auburn won that game by 23 points. They're playing at a very high level, and Georgia could clean things up a lot, and Auburn still win.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me to the other side of this question and finally getting into some positive, things that our Auburn listeners can chew on. If you're Auburn and you've got tape on Georgia, you've got tape on Georgia where you dominated them, and you now have tape on Alabama where you've seen what was successful again against that good defense. One, my question is, what's the takeaway there from Auburn? And two, how worried are you if you're Georgia, and how comfortable are you if you're Auburn, if you look at this game and see that you didn't, even though there were shifts and motions and pre-snap stuff, you didn't have to win with a lot of trick plays and smoke and mirrors. You kind of won on just pure line play, physicality, and base scheme.
There's sort of two things to this to me. The first, momentum does matter in a season long context. We don't do it a lot in our numbers because more often than not, a lot of what people take to be momentum isn't necessarily indicative of anything. But there is certainly something to be said that when a team feels invincible, they tend to play at a different level. And comfort matters. When you look back at some of the teams that have flamed out or teams that have had national titles, the 2013 Auburn team is definitely a team that did not play anywhere near the level that they ended up were at the end of the year, at the beginning of the year. They turned the corner about midseason. They got on a run, and at the end of the year, they were playing dominant football. I think people are right to make a lot of parallels, honestly, with those two teams because this Auburn team was not playing outstanding football at times early in the season. Now, I think people underestimate the fact that they scored 45 points a game in a stretch from Mercer to Ole Miss before they lost to LSU. People talk about the 40 plus run they've had since LSU. Well, they were on a 40 plus run before LSU, too. However, there is something to be said that when you feel like things are clicking, you can come out and you can sort of dominate. They did that even in the beginning of the LSU game before they kind of stuttered. I think that matters a lot. I think they're going to be able to look back at the tape and go, we've kind of got this. And my thing with Auburn really in the Alabama game, in the Georgia game, it hinges on Stidham. And this season, to me, from Auburn, a lot of people are going to say it's been about Kerryon Johnson. Kerryon Johnson has been a major impact all season. I totally get that. He's been very important. Kerryon Johnson had 3.48 yards per carry against Alabama. He did well enough to keep them honest. He was not good enough to win the game. The guy that won the game was Jarrett Stidham, going 21 of 28, 75% passing for 237 yards. When you can, in a game against a very good defense, average 8.5 yards per attempt with that much consistency, that does a lot for you. And it's the crispness and execution of those plays that matter. And one more thing I will sort of add to that, the way Malzahn's system works is that he wants to execute his plays at a very high level at tempo. And to do that, he needs to have clean, good reps. As the season progresses, as they have those sort of cupcake games where everybody sort of brushes aside and goes, well, it's Arkansas, and Arkansas is terrible. Well, when they have those games and they execute well and they get good reps, the team kind of gets a feeling of what it looks like when they do it right. They get, if you want, the muscle memory of how to execute it. And that's what leads into those games late in the season where they can turn around and snap the football on us. They run their RPOs. And Stidham knows, okay, I look at this guy, he's not open. This guy, he's not open. Okay, throw the receiver screen. And it's just bang, bang, bang because he knows what's coming. He's seen it before. And despite all the pressure and everything going around, he's really comfortable making those sort of judgment calls. So I don't think there's a ton that they're going to take from the tape necessarily. I think the biggest thing that they're going to see from the tape is, hey, we've been doing this right. And it's the exact opposite of what we talked about Georgia earlier. And I think it's still a concern. Georgia has not given Fromm nearly enough reps for Fromm to feel like he knows how to make the plays correctly. And when Fromm gets an easy opportunity in the game, it's kind of new to him. Even though he's played a lot of bad opponents, they haven't let him get those easy opportunities to get a rhythm, to understand how it goes, to, hey, when you got a guy open, this is how you put the air on the ball and lead the receiver. And the receiver knows that he's got a ball wide open. This has happened before. It's comfortable. You just make the play. Auburn's got that down pat. It's a significant advantage, and I think that's the biggest thing for them going into the game. The one question mark on all that, of course, is injury history and all too, because if guys are banged up, it's going to change the way they have to run their offense.
All right, so I think we can dive deeper into this, or we can go with a baseline of numbers. So why don't we go ahead, get into the computer model, see what it says, and sort of just digest that.
So both teams I know have followed this program at least a little bit through the season. I know we've kind of been critical of Auburn to a certain extent. Late in the year, when they've had these two big wins, we didn't pick them to win either game. I don't think most people did. I will say that if you followed us from the beginning of the year, you'd know that we were actually very high on Auburn. And even after it's kind of funny because they lose to LSU on October 14th. When we were talking about on our show that we felt like one, Auburn wasn't out of it because it was one loss, didn't really matter. Two, we also felt like Auburn kind of had a fluky loss, and all the LSU fans were crowing because they won that game. We, one, thought that they were going to lose to Florida. And two, we felt like, okay, this was kind of an aberration. Auburn dominated this game in the first quarter the way we thought they would. We thought Auburn was going to blow out LSU. Not a whole lot has changed, really. And as much as anything, Auburn has improved late in the year. Georgia's fallen back a little bit with the Auburn win. So we're running a model now on the same two teams. The results aren't too dissimilar. You've got very good rush defenses across the board here. I'll note that Georgia's has fallen off significantly. They were in the 60, about, I think, 67% the last time they played. They're now down to 77%. So they've had about a 10% drop in rush defense just in the past 3 or 4 games. The Auburn game was a big chunk of it, but they also weren't necessarily completely and utterly dominant, even against Kentucky and Georgia Tech. Relative to how Georgia Tech and Kentucky do, they're actually not very good teams in general. So their rush defense has fallen off quite a bit. Still very, very good, though. The same coin, Auburn, great rush defense, 70%. Pass defense has actually improved to 73%. Georgia's pass defense is excellent at 78%. These are two very good defenses, and this gets back to the fact that I don't think the result in the last game was necessarily true. Georgia's defense is elite, and you don't expect elite defenses to give up 40 points absent some sort of interesting, weird set of circumstances. When you run the numbers and everything, how it works out, and the fact that Auburn has improved, the Auburn passing game is caught up to the Georgia passing game, you end up with a situation where Auburn has a slight edge in yards per play predicted, 5.15 yards per play, 4.8. Both teams expected to be about 4 yards per carry. Auburn's one advantage is they're a little bit better, 7 yard per attempt predicted versus 6.5. And when you predict the score prediction, though, again, Georgia is a little bit more efficient in scoring than Auburn. Same thing in this last game, even in the Iron Bowl. Auburn kind of tied up Alabama in yardage. They did a little bit better. Alabama really squandered a lot of opportunities. But for the most part, Auburn has had an issue where they have a lot of drives that stall. They had an early turnover where if they hadn't fumbled the ball and they'd scored early in that game, they probably would have put the Iron Bowl away earlier. As much as the red zone defense is very good, they do leave a lot of yards on the field. Because of that, even with a yardage advantage, it's still predicting Georgia to win. However, unlike last time where Georgia had a significant edge of at least a few points, now it's actually saying Georgia 24, Auburn 23. So we know the old result. We know it's now predicting it to be closer, but this still has this more or less a dead heat between Auburn and Georgia.
And I think Auburn fans are going to be frustrated because, we have picked them to lose to Georgia and Auburn, or Georgia and Alabama. And now they're looking at a computer model that shows a Georgia win, even though they played them 2 weeks ago. And they're like, okay, your computer doesn't know what it's talking about. But the computer is just looking at the numbers. And one of the things that it's not looking at that I think is also not in Auburn's favor is what you mentioned before, and that's injuries. Kerryon Johnson, the way he went down in that Alabama game looked real bad. I know after he got the hit from, I think it was Harrison, it might have been Hootie. After he got the hit on the sideline, he did come back and get the touchdown. But he dropped to the field on that one carry. And maybe it was something weird, and maybe they've already come out and said something knowing Gus. They haven't. But then you had Cam Martin get dinged a little bit, which he hasn't been that effective this year. I couldn't see him being super effective as a primary workhorse back. He's a good change of pace guy. And then we know Cam Petway's still hurt. So I know you mentioned earlier that Kerryon Johnson hasn't been the guy that won them all these big games as far as the season and consistency and all that, but he has been a something good enough offensively in the running game to make Stidham be comfortable and not have to be the guy. I know you mentioned in our Iron Bowl preview that when Stidham hasn't had a complimentary run game, he has struggled a good bit. And I think we saw in the Alabama game, Kerryon Johnson did just enough to keep the pressure off. So, not getting into your final gut score yet, but talk a little bit about whether or not the injuries you saw, both Auburn defensively and potentially Kerryon Johnson, changes how you would potentially pick this game.
I do think it's a significant impact. I think something notable here, looking back at even the last Georgia results, so I'm going to start there. They ran for 5.22 yards per carry against Georgia. And that's a good result, but it was actually kind of abnormal because we know Georgia has a good defense, right? Just from an abstract perspective, we know they're pretty good because we've seen them compared to enough teams. Auburn had a very better per carry average. And when I say per carry average right now, I'm actually talking about Kerryon Johnson specifically, okay? Kerryon averaged 5 yards per play against Mississippi State. He averaged 5 yards per play against Texas A&M. He averaged 5.03 against LSU, 5.22 against Georgia. I think it was very unusual that he had a better day against Georgia than he had against all those teams. And again, he averaged 3.48, 3.47 yards per play against Alabama. So as a baseline, I think his performance against Georgia was a genuine aberration. He has not done that well against good teams all year. Georgia did not play that game very well. Now, if you take him out of the mix and you have Petway out of the mix, that hurts. And that Georgia game took Kerryon Johnson having what was really his most effective game statistically all season for them to have that kind of a win. 32 carries, 167 yards. That game, even as it was a bit of a statistical aberration. It was. So if he's not in the game and you don't have that, at the very least, you should expect the game to be significantly closer because their run game put a tremendous amount of pressure on Georgia that allowed the passing game to open up, and it put more pressure on Georgia than they'd been able to generate in most any other major game they played all year. We know what they looked like early in the season when they didn't have Kerryon. We saw them in the Georgia Southern game, the Clemson game, the Mercer game. They were pretty effective against Georgia Southern. We actually both think they were actually a lot more effective against Mercer than most think, but against the Clemson game, they shut down. And I think in the back of everyone's minds is going to be that Clemson game because they're going to go, man, if we couldn't move the ball against Clemson with Cam Petway, how are we going to do it without Cam Petway and Johnson? And I think it's a fair question. I do think Martin is a solid back. I think he could play at a decent level. He's definitely a change of pace guy, and he's not going to run between the tackles. Again, a lot of what they do is based off all this formational mishmash stuff. If Georgia isn't afraid of the running back being able to pound them in the middle of the field, it lets them get faster players in the field, and they can sit in more of nickel dime package kind of stuff and not have to worry about a running back running them over. The other problem is Cam Martin himself, his injury looked to be an ankle injury, and he looked like he sprained it pretty bad. I think even if he does play, I don't expect him to be that explosive. If he was, then I think there's some things Auburn could do. But the last few carries of that game, they basically gave the ball to Cam Martin because they knew he would hold it, and he jogged forward and got tackled behind the line of scrimmage 3 times in a row. There was nothing in his game at that point. I think that's beyond alarming, frankly. The flip side of this is I think Stidham has been operating at a very high level. Again, what he did against Alabama's secondary was almost incredible, frankly, and he made everything look easy, but it's hard to underestimate how many of those throws to open guys came because he understood where the coverage was and when guys were going to run back to the ball. And every one of those was anticipated such that the ball got there when the guy was wide open, when they were very rarely open the entire play. But he's not going to be able to do that if Georgia can drop a bunch of guys into coverage. That's not something he's faced all year. And more importantly, it's going to be a lot tougher for him when they get in obvious passing situations. Because again, even in that Iron Bowl last week, there was a point about midway through the game where they got a lot more limited offensively, and it came because they got in some obvious passing situations, and Stidham didn't handle it very well because Alabama was able to get pressure, and he did panic a little bit and leave the pocket. His offensive line usually keeps that from happening, but when they didn't have as the threat of the run and the other team could pin their ears back a lot more because they weren't terrified of Kerryon Johnson, they got a lot more effective. The last thing I will say is on the defensive side of the ball, right now they appear to be pretty healthy. Denson played most of that game. Trey Williams played. I don't think he was all that limited. Probably a little bit. I think there were a couple times he probably could have made a tackle where he didn't otherwise. But the nice thing about an upper body injury is you can at least usually get yourself in the right position. The one guy that I thought was interesting was Trae Matthews went out for a series to start the second half. Alabama marched right down the field running the ball to start the second half, and they scored, and everybody's like, okay, well, this game's changed. But the subtle thing that they didn't even really touch on the broadcast was that Trey Marshall got hurt at the very beginning of that series. And when he was out, their run defense suffered tremendously. And I think it showed to me how much depth is an important factor for their defense. And while I think they're pretty healthy, they're going to be banged up coming out of that game because they had a lot of guys in and out of the lineup. So I don't think defense is necessarily a direct issue right now, but they've got a lot of guys banged up. And we saw in that game a lot of guys going in and out of the lineup. So I think that's also something to keep an eye on because they definitely suffered. In fact, they suffered really significantly when they had to rotate guys on the defensive side of the ball as well.
All right. So I guess since we've kind of beaten this thing to death from every angle that we can, you said what you think about the injuries with Kerryon Johnson. So go ahead and give us your gut prediction relative to the model. Remind everybody what the model score was, and then tell us what you think.
Okay, the model score is Georgia 24, Auburn 23. And am I allowed to cheat here? Because I want to give you a score with Kerryon and without Kerryon. I think it matters that much.
Yeah, give me both.
I think it does matter a lot. And I think the short answer is with Kerryon, Auburn wins this game. And I think if Kerryon is actually pretty healthy, I think they win fairly comfortably. I'm going to go with something around 31-21. I don't think the game is going to be an utter blowout. I just think Georgia's better than that. But Auburn is clicking so much offensively right now, they're going to score points. Very, very good offenses will score points on any team. And especially, you could shut down a run game. And we saw that with Alabama. We saw it with Alabama last year. If you got a dual threat quarterback and you're, and you're dependent upon the run, we've seen it with Ohio State a lot. But if you got a guy that can pass the ball, if you have a guy that can sit in the pocket and deliver the ball downfield like Stidham's been able to do, you're going to score. The problem is if you don't have Kerryon Johnson and you lack that complement in the run game, Georgia is darn disruptive. Their linebackers are very fast and very active. They were able to take them out of the game by basically just out muscling them at the line of scrimmage last year. If they're not able to do that and the linebackers aren't afraid of the run, this worm turns quite a bit. I think it takes probably as much as 2 touchdowns off the board. And I just told you it was a 31-21 score. So if they're not in the game and Auburn has to throw continually 2 touchdowns off the board, I think it's Georgia 21, Auburn 17. I think if Kerryon Johnson, Cameron Petway can't play, and Cam Martin is injured, it will be devastating to the Auburn offense in this football game.
I tend to agree, and I think it's weird for us to say this because we talked about how we think Kerryon Johnson is a good running back, but hasn't been this like 8-yard per carry, Heisman Trophy candidate, even though some might say he's MVP of his team. It is interesting, though, because you don't need a lot. When you're a good team, you're a good offense, and you're a great defense, you don't need a lot from one particular unit to keep the defense honest enough to have the other unit be really, really successful. So I agree with you. I actually think it's worse. If Kerryon Johnson doesn't play in this game, I'm going 28-17 Georgia. If he does play in this game and he's healthy, I think Auburn wins it again. I think it's a lot closer, a whole lot closer. But I think Auburn wins it again. Give me 27-23 Auburn. So if Kerryon Johnson, we won't do the MVP thing for both sides, but if Kerryon Johnson is healthy in the game and Auburn wins, do you think he's the MVP, or are you going to give it to Stidham?
I think in this game, in this matchup, I think he probably would have to be the MVP. He's going to have to carry the team. It's the same thing as last time. Georgia and Alabama are built very differently. Georgia is a lot faster. Alabama was bigger. They were balanced enough that they managed to beat those teams in different ways. They ran the ball much better against Georgia, really almost double the per carry average against Georgia that they had against Alabama. So they're going to have to run the ball. If he's healthy, he's probably going to end up being the MVP and carrying the team. I think if they have to depend on Stidham, I just don't think, and it's not going to be Stidham. I don't think that their offensive line and the receivers are good enough to be a spread, throw the ball every play offense, because mainly that Georgia's defense is really well built to handle that type of offense.
All right. Anything else on this one?
I think the only thing I'll leave here is to really note when we talk about the loss of Kerryon Johnson, we haven't been super, super, super high on Kerryon Johnson. We both think he's a very good tailback. The biggest deal really is you're going way down your depth chart if he's not in the game. And Malik Miller probably ends up handling the load. It's possible that Malik is a dominant guy, but even in sort of backup scrub time, he's only averaging 4 yards per carry. Came off a serious knee injury last year. I just don't believe that he's going to be able to be anywhere close to the level of Kerryon, who, and I'm curious if you agree with me on this. In retrospect, the way he's played the last few games, if Kerryon had been healthy the entire season and had gotten 30 carries per game all year, I think he would be a serious Heisman contender. And that's the kind of player you're losing.
Yeah, and I was high on him last year. I'll say this as many times as I can, not to give myself credit, just more to be like, I wonder what Gus was thinking. I know he was hurt some last year and in this year, but I was higher on him last year all year than Ken Petway. I think he would be in the Heisman discussion, possibly because Auburn wouldn't have that loss against Clemson. But I don't know that he's a Heisman running back. I think we've got multiple 7-8 yard per carry running backs in the SEC this year. I think he's a 5.3 yard per carry guy, 5.1, something like that, which is still for an SEC workhorse running back who's not got a lot of backup spelling. He's a great running back. But I think he is good enough that, like we've said this whole show, without any depth behind him, he's good enough that you're going to feel it so much that you're probably not going to be able to overcome it. They might. They haven't had to, and you hate to see with so little time to prep having to adjust your scheme into a complete overhaul mode to accommodate not being able to run the ball. Hopefully they won't have to. Hopefully he recovers in a week. It is interesting to see these championship games where they have to turn around after a big game and play their opponent in the championship. So, all right, y'all. Thanks so much. This was a fun one. We love talking about the SEC championship, obviously, since we are SEC fans. Want to remind you, give us your scores in the comments. Give us your MVP in the comments. Feel free to mix it up with one another. Just keep it clean. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.